You're listening to God, Law, and Liberty with David Fowler and Gary Humble. We're putting culture on a collision course with the truth.
All right, David, I want to get started today with the new castration law that's going into effect to homogenize society.
Yeah,
you heard about that?
The Orson Welles rule.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the planets, the Martians are coming. Yeah.
No more men.
Yeah, no more men.
Down with toxic masculinity.
Yeah, that's it. And if you are now shocked into listening, you're going to really like what we have to say that's actually true.
Right, there you go.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what our listeners thought. I guess we'll find out by how many people paid attention. But I really enjoyed our last podcast. It to me was exciting, and much of it was stuff I'm just now really kind of thinking deeply about myself.
Yeah, I'm learning while we do these podcasts because I feel like you say something, I'm like, yeah, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
As much conversation as we've had about some of these things.
Sure. And in the last podcast, we were talking. This was our first really opportunity to take a current news event, this amicus brief that was recently filed by the Tennessee Independent Baptists for Religious Liberty, and what they were saying in their brief relative to the Supreme Court's decision from 2015 about same-sex marriage in the Obergefell case.
And we brought up this idea about liberty of conscience.
Right. Yeah. And what does that mean? Does it mean I only get to think things in my head, or maybe I have the freedom of speech to say them, or do I have a freedom to live them out at all?
Right.
And that in itself is a very interesting thing. And at some point we need to come back and talk about the cake baker cases, Jack Phillips' Masterpiece Cake Shop. There's Arlene's Florist. I think they've applied for permission to appeal on that case. And we need to talk about that sphere of liberty. I'm engaged in commerce, and why can't I decide who I want to serve?
Right.
Okay. And this whole idea that there was a sphere
You mean like why can't YouTube delete all of the conservative YouTube channels?
Yeah, if it's theirs. Now,
that seems completely fine.
Well, yeah, that seems completely fine. And interestingly, in some of these areas, you do get into situations where you're operating under government licenses, government permissions, like the broadcasting companies, ABC and all those. And so those complicate the issue. But I'm just talking about
right.
You want me to fix your car or paint your house or make you a cake or cater your birthday party or something. And and the fact that we know intuitively that it's my business and I kind of run my business, and as long as I'm not poisoning your food or stealing your money or something like that, look at the signs: no shirt, no shoes, no service.
Right.
Well, that
used to be okay.
Yeah. Well, it still is as far as I know. But what if somebody says, well, that's demeaning, that's stigmatizing. I'm a Tennessee hillbilly, and it denies my heritage. If I can't go into the restaurant, we need a law on that, And if I can pass it, maybe fine. It might be a stupid law, but we have people running to the Supreme Court and saying you need to write barefootism into the U.S. Constitution as a liberty right. Everybody say that's nuts. Well, we're doing lots of nutsy things, but
or you could say, no. What do you mean by shirt?
Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah, Bill Clinton. It depends on what a shirt is. Yeah. But we talked about the importance of the law and its instructional aspect, and how we mentioned that the whole issue of same-sex marriage could be raised if every Christian in Tennessee who believes marriage is an ordinance from God, it's a creational law or a Catholic sacrament, said, I cannot affix my name to a document that defines marriage contrary to God's law. So I'm not going to be the agent of the state to sign that document. Or if couples who were getting ready to marry said, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman, but in order for me to get benefits, tax benefits, Social Security benefits, whatever it might be, I have to sign a license that defines marriage contrary to my beliefs.
Right.
So what if
that acknowledges that marriage has nothing to do
with
gender.
male or female? Yeah. That's right. So if all those Christian people just said we're not going to do it, you'd eventually have people saying, well, how do I get married? Who's willing to sign my license? You'd have a small group of people that say, come here, I don't mind, I'll sign your license. And I'm sure there'd be people, but you can imagine the stink that would rise if everybody understood what these Baptists were saying. If the Presbyterians who supported the Westminster Confession and make it a part of, their doctrinal confession of faith actually lived like they were Presbyterians in Westminsters and said, I will not sign that document. I mean, wouldn't that be an incredible thing too? Right. You gave birth to something you apparently don't even believe, even though I suspect you make your elders or your deacons, acknowledge that this is part of the confessions of our church of the things that we believe. So law teaches and law instructs. And as Christians, we ought to understand that. I mean, of all people that ought to understand it, we're the people of the book that instructs. The Torah, the word Torah is instruction, right? And unfortunately, we don't get it. But for lack of a better word, I don't want this to sound adversarial, but the other side, gets what law communicates. And I want us to take a little time to think about that today and put it again in a contemporary context. In Tennessee, we'll be looking in January at the abortion issue. Right. And should we attack Roe versus Wade? We'll be looking under the God-given marriage initiative we started. How do we define marriage and how do we recognize marriage in Tennessee?
Well, and as we get into that, I just want to say, because we're going to talk today about how the law, in fact, is educative and instructive in our culture. And for me personally, that's one of the biggest things that I've learned since coming to here, Family Action Council of Tennessee. I think I've always believed that we should do the right thing, and I've always believed that God's word is supreme, and I've always been engaged in politics, and I always thought that law should follow God's law. But I guess to some degree, never really had a firm understanding as to why I should be so vigilant about that being the case. And I think probably a lot of Christians find themselves there until, and I know you put this in your book, Politics of Loving God, which, by the way, is available at Amazon.com. But I know in one of your chapters there, you really dug into the fact that the law is educative. The laws that we put on the books that we grow up with teach us what is right and what is wrong. We said this in an earlier episode of the podcast. If something is legal, it would stand to reason that we grow up assuming that thing that is legal is good and right,
or at least okay, right?
Yeah. At least it's not. Yeah, at least it's not
so
evil
bad
or
that
bad.
we should punish it, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So anyway,
and if the law prohibits something,
yeah,
well, that must really be bad,
right?
That we don't let you do that.
So for a Christian, wouldn't it stand to reason that we would want those laws to mimic what we believe about God and how that informs the way that we live our lives?
Yeah, and if to put it in a very real context for all of us as parents, we've all been children. Not all of us have been parents, but we've all had parents who've said, "Don't do that, don't do that." They taught us things, and as we look back, we often will say, "I'm really glad my parents taught me that, the value of hard work or of discipline or being conscientious or whatever it might have been, or my parents taught me things that I'm having to unlearn." Okay, because parents are the law; they're the first law in a child's life. That's where we learn the understanding of authority and how authority operates and what obedience and respect for authority looks like. And they lay down the law for us, okay? But we'll, particularly as Christians, we'll acknowledge all that takes place at home, and it takes place in the church polity. Why the pastor went out here and did something, and the board and the elders or the deacons didn't approve it or whatever. And then we run over and we just say, "Oh, God doesn't care about law
somehow
and government."
We shouldn't care if it happens in government.
And I don't love my children if I don't lay down the law for them, if I don't lay down laws that instruct them well. So how well do I love my neighbor if I don't care what the general laws instruct them as to what is good and restrain them as to what is evil? Now, today, I want to bring this into the context of law. We're God, law, and liberty. So let's bring it into law. Mm-hmm. And there was a quote that I read 20 years ago, I guess, when I first got into politics. I was thinking through all this stuff before I even ran for office. Why would I run for office? Why would I do this? And I ran into a case, and the pro-life community knows it well, called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. It's the 1992 decision by the United States Supreme Court. It's really one of the last two major cases where the court really reaffirmed Roe. 19 years after Roe, 73 to 1992. So when we go back to the legislature this year and dealing with the abortion issue, you will hear lawyers talking about Planned Parenthood versus Casey. In the hearings we had in August in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, everybody addressed Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Yeah. So it's a big thing. But this is the sentence that radically reoriented my thinking about law. Now, again, this is 20 years ago. I graduated from law school 30-something years ago. So this is not something I learned in law school. Mm-hmm. It's part of the work of God in my life as I got out of law school and I began looking at Scripture and I began trying to think biblically. I went back and read that opinion. In this sentence, I'd love for you to read it. It just hit me like a 2x4 upside of the head. Now, they're justifying, let me set the context. They're justifying why we cannot reverse Roe versus Wade.
And is this Kennedy or
this is Kennedy?
Is this Kennedy's opinion? Yeah. He says, for 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society, in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. The Constitution serves human values, and while the effect of reliance on Roe cannot be exactly measured, neither can the certain cost of overruling Roe for people who have ordered their thinking and living around that case be dismissed.
Yes. Wow. Notice what they said. That very first sentence is the one that caught me. They have defined, read that part again up at the top. They have defined their view of themselves.
They define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion.
Yes.
Is that what defines you? The fact that you can get an abortion?
Well, it has helped define.
It's an incredible statement.
And yeah, it really is. And then that last part of that last sentence in that paragraph, which you had said, again, that shaped their thinking or something. What was that statement? It's in the last sentence, the last part.
Well, it's ordered their thinking and living.
Yes. Yeah. Law orders our thinking and living. It helps us define what we see as good and bad. It defines our place in society and by my view of myself. So, in other words, the court is saying, we've had abortion for 20 years, and it's changed the way we understand human sexuality, reproduction, parenthood, childhood. Children are no longer a blessing from the Lord, and blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Instead, it's a burden, costs me money, interferes with my education, my economics. Remember, that's how they first started.
I guess you're blessed as long as you want to have them and don't want to abort them.
That's right. Yeah. So it's all about me. It's the autonomy. That's the case where Kennedy also said personal autonomy, where you define meaning and the universe for yourself. So everything now is about me. Okay. We were talking the other day that we would expect the law, whether you had a birth certificate or not, to chase you down and say, hey, Gary, you got 3 kids over here and you need to protect them. Well, autonomy says, well, they're just a burden to me. Right.
My kids might feel differently.
They might feel differently, but it's about me. Okay. So they're conceding here that the law teaches and educates. Okay. This is
because of the fact that Roe has been around since 1973 and people have been thinking as if abortion is available all these years.
And it's okay. So therefore, it's all right to put these other things in priority.
And we can't change that on everybody now. They've grown up with this.
That's right. Yeah. So now let me read you something else. This is a book.
It's incredible.
It's hard to find anymore, but it's called After the Ball. The subtitle is How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s, by two really bright guys in the academic field, Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen.
Funny enough, this particular book came out of Oregon, which I find interesting. Seems wholly appropriate. Sorry,
and they really lay down a blueprint for saying, here's how we're going to accomplish this. Now, as it turned out, they were a decade early. Didn't really happen in the 90s. It started happening in the 90s. But as I read this book, I thought these guys get what Christians don't understand, which is just, like I say, I didn't get it until I read this maybe 20 years ago about the law teaching. I thought the law taught me about how to personally be a good moral person, but it didn't teach anybody else anything. And it was God's law that taught me about being a good Christian. The other law was just about what I could do in civil society. It didn't teach or communicate anything.
Right.
So here these guys are, and they're saying, here's the things we need to do. And in the legal field, they say we need to get rid of the sodomy statutes. Now, very few people were ever prosecuted under the sodomy statutes. They were often prosecuted for public indecency, but we didn't know what was going on in somebody's home, and Bob and Fred may live together, and may all think that they're homosexual, but
nobody's looking through the windows.
Nobody's looking through the windows, yeah. And, of course, they want to raise the specter that the next thing you know, Robert Bork's going to be peering in, the big fight over Robert Bork, peering in your windows trying to find out if you're engaged in homosexual sex. But here's what they wrote. Many gays, now these are gay men. These are homosexual men saying many gays think because of the lax enforcement, they're getting off lightly, that the system is tolerably lenient. But they are misled. They haven't understood how sodomy laws are intended to function. And the next page, he goes on and says, here is the paramount reason for getting rid of them. He lists 5. The 6th reason is paramount. The survival of gay sodomy laws, even unenforced, sends a message to both straights and gays that homosexuality is intrinsically wrong, sinful, because it's, quote, unnatural. And that really is the underlying purpose of the law. See, he just said over here, don't think you're getting off lightly. Nobody ever prosecutes you for that. Yeah, if I go out in the public park and have, sex with a guy, I get prosecuted. But these laws don't infringe on what I do at home. But you don't understand the purpose of the law. He's now telling you, here's the purpose of the law. To, quote, stand bolt upright in the social plane as ugly monuments, visible symbols of society's moral condemnation of gays. Thus, sodomy laws function less as statutes to put people in jail than as parliamentary resolutions. Through them, straights have passed a resolution against homosexuality. Unless you've been misled, consider the titles of these laws. Crimes against nature, Arizona. Unnatural and perverted sexual practices, Maryland. Sodomy and buggery, Massachusetts. Unnatural and lascivious acts, Florida. Unnatural intercourse, Mississippi. Sexual psychopaths, District of Columbia.
Wow.
So he's saying the fact that nobody's prosecuting you for this, you don't understand the real purpose of the law. It's teaching people. It's sending a message. And it's even communicated in the title.
Regardless if it's enforcement.
That's right.
It's informing culture that this is wrong.
Yeah. So now let's read. I gave you today a copy of some of the pages out of the complaint that was filed by Valeria Tanko against Bill Haslam. This is the same-sex marriage case that went up to the United States Supreme Court.
This was part of the Obergefell case.
This is part of the Obergefell. Again, we want to make sure our listeners understand that was a case by Obergefell against Ohio law. Right. This is a Tanko versus Haslam, but they all were consolidated.
There were 4 cases
consolidated. Supreme Court heard all 4. But this is the original complaint filed against Bill Haslam. And you'll just read a few of these little excerpts that I've highlighted, and you'll see how it fits after the ball, what I just read.
Yeah, it says, by denying recognition to the plaintiff's otherwise valid marriages, Tennessee instructs all state officials, and indeed all persons with whom same-sex couples interact, including their own children, their marriage is less worthy than the marriages of others.
So it instructs.
It instructs. They get that. Another statement, they say, denial to same-sex couples of the status of being married in the eyes of the state, despite their having previously entered into a legal marriage in another jurisdiction, conveys the state's view that the couple's marriage is of lesser value and unworthy of legal recognition and support. Again, the idea of
conveys
teaching,
a view.
Conveys, instructing.
Right. And then we see the same thing, I think, in that next paragraph.
For it tells same-sex couples in all the world that their otherwise valid marriages are unworthy of recognition in the state of Tennessee. The anti-recognition laws instruct all state officials and indeed all persons with whom same-sex couples interact, again, including their own children, their marriage.
Right. Yeah. So they're saying the law instructs, the law conveys a view, it teaches, it tells. Well, that's exactly what these guys are saying. Is this original to them because they went to Harvard or wherever else it was? No, it's what the Bible says law does. The Bible, it says in Galatians 3:21, I think it is, says the way it's translated, not in the King James, but in many of the translations, it was the law was your tutor to lead you to Christ. Why was the law given, it says in Romans and in Galatians? It was given to make clear to you this exceedingly sinfulness of sin, because it said these things are wrong. These things are wrong. And as that law presses on you, you realize, oh my goodness, I can't keep any of this. I fail against this, and this is God's law. How am I going to stand in front of God? Can I say, well, at least I helped a little old lady across the street today? Does that make up for everything else I did today that was wrong, or I stole, or I lied, or whatever at work? No. So it was our tutor, it was our guide. It instructed us of our need for salvation before God. I mean, of all people, read Psalm 119 about the law and its instruction and its teaching and its meditation, and I need your law to guide me and all of that. Of all people, we should understand this.
Yeah, in the Old Testament, weren't Jews instructed to have the law, know, on their foreheads?
That's right.
Don't forget this.
Yes, and speak of it when you lie down and when you rise up and when you go on your way, and instruct your children in Deuteronomy, I think it's 6. And here's the other thing about it in terms of the instructions. Deuteronomy chapter 4, I think it is, verse 6, it says that the other nations will look at you and your prosperity, and they will say, what other nation has a law like these? Because you live under these laws. Wow. It's the provoking of jealousy that we actually read about again in Romans chapter, I think it is about 11, with the Jews, that at some point the Jews will be provoked to jealousy when God removes the blinders, and they'll say, you're getting all the promises that we were promised. Oh, wait a minute. I don't like that.
Yeah.
And they would be brought to Christ. So the law is a teacher, the law instructs. Now let's bring it even more current. I got for you a copy of a couple of pages from a complaint filed in, I think it's April. Is that right? Yeah, April of this year.
About the transgender birth certificate.
Against Governor Lee. Yeah. And for our listeners and viewers to understand, this is a case filed by, I think, four or five individuals. Their birth certificates reflected their biological sex based upon their biology and anatomy.
Shocking.
Yeah. And as adults, they say, well, I've always felt like I was something else. And they actually have pictures of these individuals in the complaint. And sure enough, if you looked at him, one of them, he looks as much like a man as you do. I would say he's a man if I didn't know better. But he was born a woman. So they're suing because the state does not allow you to change your birth certificate, because the birth certificate reflects what you were at birth. Best I can tell from reading the complaint, if I remember correctly, none of these people indicate that they were born with ambiguous genitalia. And the doctor just said, well, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I think you're going to wind up a boy. And that does happen in a very, very small, less than 1% of the cases, I think it is. So they're not complaining about that, but read what they say, that it's, again, we get this idea, and this same thing is repeated for each of the plaintiffs.
Yeah, one of these points, Ms. Gore also objects to the state's message.
Yep, there it is.
That
Message.
sex is determined solely by the appearance of external genitals. So she's saying that the fact that the law is such that the state is sending a message.
That sex is biological.
Yeah.
And she says, no,
Yeah.
sex is psychological.
We
It's
can't
a whole
have
bunch
that.
of other things. So you can't get away from the fact the law is going to send a message, right?
Yeah. Mr. Scott also objects to the state's message
Right.
that sex is determined solely by the appearance of external genitals at the time of birth, a message that is inconsistent with the scientific and medical understanding of sex. Wow. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Obviously, it's inconsistent.
So
with
every
science.
law sends a message, okay? Now this is where this is important in terms of these Baptist pastors. And I don't know if they've thought this thing through all the way to the conclusion. I don't know. I'm not saying they haven't. They may have. I don't think I had, when I first read their brief, thought it to its end. But every law conveys a message, okay? Now, I can't complain about the message as long as that message in some ways doesn't compel me to do something. If the law is a negative, it may prohibit me from doing something, but even that sends a message. It sends a message that murder's wrong, right? You shouldn't kill people. But what these pastors are saying is that you have taken this concept of marriage. Now, this goes back to what we were saying. Marriage is a natural, organic thing. People living before the face of God, coram Deo, they marry. Men and women marry. They procreate. They create children. And you have now said, government of the state of Tennessee, no. We now create marriage, and the only way you can marry is to get a permission slip from us, couple, and that permission slip defines what it is you're doing. And minister, if that's going to be legal, you have to sign it. Well, all of a sudden, what have you done? You have taken something that was organic, where there was a sphere that Calvin and Kuyper and the Westminster Divines would have all said, well, that's a sphere not under strictly the church, not strictly under the government. Men and women do this.
Right.
And now you've interfered with this whole sphere of conscience in which people conduct their lives naturally. And you've made it an artificial thing. That's what we talked about in the last podcast. And now, because you've removed it from the realm of the natural and made it something artificial, I have to start doing something, and I have to agree to this message in order to do it.
But in addition, in line with what we're saying, the fact of the law being that way, we are also teaching our children that marriage, guess what? Marriage doesn't come from God. Marriage isn't just this thing that happens between a man and a woman. Marriage comes from the state.
That's
the
right.
state decides whether or not you can or cannot get married and
what it is.
and what it is.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the message right now that we are communicating to our children.
Right.
Through law.
And so now we're moving into the next phase, as I mentioned in our last podcast, of, well, what does it mean to be a parent?
And it's why when you can ask people this question we have in some surveys, so what, do you think, a simple question, do you think marriage comes from God or from the state? Some people they aren't sure how to answer that question.
Right.
And definitely when you ask, do you feel like you need a marriage license to be married? Even a substantial number of Christians will say, well, yeah. I need a license from the state to be married because that's what we've been taught and ingrained to believe.
Yeah. We've lost track of what was intended. So again, we'll probably use this off and on for the next several years. Sorry, listeners, viewers. The Tocqueville statement that the lights will gradually go out. If they ever go out, they'll go out gradually. We won't sit here and, for instance, nobody sat here in Tennessee and said, well, you can only get married if you have a license. And that's okay because we're really trying to keep blacks and whites from marrying, and we got a biblical justification for that, they said, or thought, or whatever it was. But
Which
that's
back in the 20s and 30s was the original intent of marriage licenses in
many
states.
That's right, many of them were. And so we didn't stop and think, well, what will this ultimately do when we now say this is the only way to marry and you have to get our permission? As I said, there was a Supreme Court case, and I probably can't pull it up quickly enough because these are not scripted. We don't sit down and say, okay.
We're just having a conversation.
Yeah, we're just having a conversation. But the Supreme Court in a case in 1877, Meister versus Moore, actually said that that the marriage license laws did not create marriages, that right is not conferred by the government. And the original laws were not intended
Marriages
to do
were
that.
happening way before states were licensing marriages.
Yeah. So anyway, that's
while you're looking,
Yeah,
if you're
yeah.
going to find it, I want to bring up a point because you read these statements earlier from this book After the Ball, which to be clear, this book is a book for gay activists. That's what it was written for. It was written for gay activists. Hey, here's how you need to get the message out. Here's how we need to overcome the general public's disdain for homosexuality, whatever. Here's how we do it. Here's the plan. And they realized that getting rid of sodomy laws was important because of the instructive nature of laws. And I just that point, I find it interesting that, and again, I keep bringing this up, but it's just something that I can't get away from, this indictment upon the church that Christians, they don't get the instructive nature of the law. I have been in this conversation so many times, and in fact, over the last 10 years or so, I've had to kind of reformulate my thoughts on same-sex marriage in terms of law, because you've got this incredibly hard push for a social justice kind of church, especially in the evangelical church. Right. And there's a big push to, I've seen people say this, that we've evolved. Well, that using that word in a Christian context is horrible on several levels, but God doesn't evolve. Yeah. Theology doesn't evolve. What God thinks about men and women in marriage or anything doesn't evolve, no matter what happens in society. And so because of that social justice push in the church, there's this we've bought into the love is love mantra, and what's wrong with love? And at the end of the day, it's we want, and I say Bob and Fred not in a derogatory sense, but just to say a couple of names here. We, these two gay men, let's just call them Bob and Fred. We want them to come to know Jesus, sure, ultimately, and we don't want to push them off, and we don't want them to perceive from us that we hate them. So we really have convinced ourselves to accept their lifestyle, so that hopefully they walk into the church and someday they just get to know Jesus. But we never really confront them or tell them that their lifestyle's wrong, or we don't agree with homosexuality, or not that we don't agree, that God looks at homosexuality as sin, plain and simple. And in all of that, we miss the whole point, that by allowing these laws to continue to take place, we are doing harm to generations of people. And we're raising generations of children believing that homosexuality is completely fine because the law instructs them so, no matter what we say in the church.
Sure.
And it's just interesting to me that on the gay activist side, they get it.
Yes.
Like they know what they're doing.
Don't sit here and say, well, the law's kind of lenient. It's not that bad. Why do we care?
Right.
That's what we do. It's kind of like, well, as long as, I can kind of still have my corner of the world to live in.
We can still worship, and I can still live my life the way I want to. Why do I have to demand that Bob and Fred live their life this way? Well, it's because these laws are teaching children now for generations that this is an appropriate way of life. And the gay activists, they get it.
That's right. I commend them.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, and
they know that if they get those laws passed,
and look, I would not inhibit their ability to speak what they believe, to advocate for what they believe. The problem we've had is that we haven't been able to articulate why we believe what we believe,
right,
and why we should not allow these laws. And then when the laws are allowed, the way we look at it, and I get it.
Yeah, you're a bigot, and then
Well,
we just fold.
I think a lot that happens. But I've had neighbors who were two lesbian women. For all I know, they're not my neighbors now. I've moved, but I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't married under Tennessee law at this point. I have some other friends who are in a lesbian relationship, and they plan to get married. And we don't probably agree about much of anything on the law, but they ought to have their ability to advocate for what they believe.
Most certainly.
Sure. And I ought to be able to advocate for what I want to believe.
Yep.
Okay. Where we get into problems, and this is where we need to get into this in another episode. But rather than have the democratic debate in our Republican form of government to adopt policies, we run to the United States Supreme Court and try to get them to write everything in as a liberty right.
Yeah, everything's a right.
Yeah. And eventually, what we're doing in the name of liberty is destroying it.
Yes.
Because your liberty now means I can't do this. Your liberty now means, or my liberty now means you can't do that.
And you know who's getting that today? Feminists.
Feminists are getting it.
They're getting it with the trans movement. They've LGBT activists and feminists, especially lesbians. If you just look out there with what's happening with women today, with trans women and the athletics and competitions and all that, they get it. Sure. It's like, wait a minute, we've pushed for all these quote unquote rights. Yeah. Well, now what about my rights?
Yeah, but see, I would argue that those LGBT activists who are protesting the transgender movement are wrong. They have no right to protest. Now, here's why. If men and women are biologically different and distinct and physiologically and in many different ways, they are different. I mean, we have books like Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus or whatever for a reason. Yeah. Now, there are on those scales that some men are more effeminate than others, some women are more masculine than others. That doesn't change
it's totally
the
natural.
reality. Yeah. But so therefore, when I say marriage is defined by a man and a woman, and then they say, no, that's not relevant, that in essence what Obergefell was saying, men and women are androgynous. So we don't have to have men and women. They're interchangeable for the purpose of the fundamental institution that has always been understood as defined in terms of male and female. And now it's not. Why is it part not? Because now we're saying sex has nothing to do with biology. We just read at the top of the podcast that sex is lots of things, and so I can change my sex, and I can change it back, and I can change it and change it back, and some people do.
Oh, I'm not saying it's not their fault. They've opened Pandora's box all on themselves.
So if I now concede at any point as an LGBT activist that biology matters, that men and women matter, I've just undermined everything else that I've argued for.
In Obergefell.
That's right. And so I can't allow that. Now, I mentioned in the last podcast the case in Ohio. There was another case that was the parents who wouldn't allow the hormone treatment. There was another case where I think it was in New York or Massachusetts where two women had child by a surrogate, sperm donor. They know who the person was. They wound up losing their children into state custody. And the man who knew he'd fathered the child said, "Oh, I'd like to come in and I'll parent my child, get him out of state custody. It'd be better if I did it." The court said, "No, I can't let you do that." Because that would convey that something was wrong with the kinds of two parents that they had. The court even said it would convey that somehow children need a father figure. The children already have two parents. So see, you can't allow a crack in the door.
Right.
Well, we've probably used our time today,
but everyone says you're crazy about the parenting thing, but it's happening.
It's happening. It's going to happen. Yeah, the law's teaching us.
Well, I'm not sure what we're going to get into next episode, but I'm sure it'll be something fun.
It will be.
All right.
All right.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks for joining.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. God, Law, and Liberty is a podcast of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. We are a 100% supporter-funded nonprofit advocating for family, life, marriage, and religious liberty. For more information, please visit us at www.facttennessee.org. That's FACTennessee.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fact Tennessee.